I'll get started. Well, thanks, Wade, for inviting me to Nerd Night, and I'm very excited to kick off the reboot for 2021. And my topic for tonight is, where are all the fucking columns? Why we still love the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. Now, I'm talking about this topic because I'm an architectural historian. And, you know, in my life as a historian and as an Italian, I've always just thought about what is it with this kind of architecture? Why is it everywhere? Why do we see it in places like these theme parks? And I think it's a kind of architecture, even if you're not an architect or a historian, that you've pretty much seen everywhere and never quite knew where it came from or why there is so much of it. So I guess I'm here tonight just to answer that question for you. So I'm just starting with this statue here. Now, this lady is a muse. She's one of 9 muses who used to live on a mountain with Apollo, the god of arts and beauty and culture. And I like this statue because it kind of shows you a little bit about how the classical world and classical orders just get pastiched and just put around everywhere with no apparent reason. So you can see that, you know, she's got a kind of, she's got a kind of palette, an artist palette there. She's on the little bit of a column at the bottom, and she's got another piece of column here. And so we have this idea that the architecture of a classical world was beautifully white and clean, and when in actuality it was not at all like that. It was all coloured. So one thing that you need to know, I'm just kind of debunking the myth of classical architecture and classical sculpture. We admire it for its purity of form, but we don't actually know, or we don't actually realise that at the time it was all really multicoloured. And when I, went on my search engine to look for coloured classical sculpture, lots and lots of images came up. But I chose this guy because he's wearing a rather fabulous pair of pants. And I thought, anyone in a jumpsuit, so jumpsuits from ancient Greece. Now, where do the orders come from? What is it with classical architecture? Well, the main orders of architecture are called Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And the reason they're called like that, because they're named after the ancient Greek peoples that supposedly invent them. So you have the Dorians, around the area of Sparta, you have the Ionians in the west, and then the Corinthians up in the town of Corinth. So we're talking about 800 years or so before the Common Era. So what is the origin of these columns and why are they the way they are? Well, apparently the Doric column is an architectural abstraction of the male body. Now, the Greeks thought that the most ideal of beauty was a naked man, and I have to say that I agree with them. And the idea was that you could encapsulate or abstract the naked male beauty into a column and put him into a piece of architecture. So you can see that in this drawing here, there's the naked man, and this guy just happens to be Hercules. You notice he's very muscly. He's obviously spends quite a bit of time down at the gym with his club. And all of the columns that are Doric are in a proportion of 1:6, which means that, the width of the column is 1 and the height is 6. So that's the idea of the ideal perfect male body. And you can see that the kind of temples that were used Doric columns tended to be temples to male gods. The Ionic column. Now, the Ionic column is my favourite column because the scrolls on the top, you can see that those curly bits on the top of the columns, they're called volutes. They are apparently the abstraction of an Ionian woman's hairdo. So how could you not love a column based on a hairdo? So the proportions of the Ionic column are 1:7 because she is a matron. She is like, a developed woman. And the idea is that her body is 1 module wide and 7 high. So that's the Ionic column. Then we have the Corinthian column. Now, the Corinthian column, we know it because it has the capital, which is the top part of the column, based on an acanthus plant, which is a sort of green, leafy plant that was around in ancient Greece. And she is a maiden. So the maiden, her proportions are 1:8. So I don't know, the Greeks had this idea that as you get older, you get shorter and fatter. I don't really know where they got that from, but that's apparently what happens to women, and there it is reflected in the architecture. Now, the story of the Corinthian column is one of the more interesting ones because the legend went that there was this virgin and she's running around in the forest and she has her lunch in a basket. And she sits down and has a rest and puts her basket down on an acanthus plant and then promptly dies. We don't really know why. Maybe she had like a poison sandwich, I don't know. And who happened to be walking along just after the virgin dies? An architect. And he goes, I kind of like this sort of basket on the acanthus leaf effect. I think I might do a sketch of it and turn it into a column. And that's what happened with the Corinthians. So that's the story of the three columns. And you now will go around and you will not unsee any of this. You will now walk around the town and walk around the city, and every time you see a column, you'll go, oh yeah, a hunky male man, a hunky naked man, a frumpy middle-aged woman, and some weird guy that likes drawing baskets. So the thing about classical architecture, though, is that it's not just a way that we put buildings together, it's a language. It tells a story, it communicates something. So the ancient Greek architecture of, say, about the 5th century before the Common Era is how we identify Athens as democracy, of the birthplace of democracy. So when classical architecture is first used, it's used as a language of democratic rule. So that's why I've got Pericles in the 5th century BC with the Parthenon. What happens with this guy here, Alexander the Great, is that classical architecture starts to be used as a language of empire. So the Greeks are actually going beyond the Greek peninsula, and this is the area that was part of the reign of Alexander the Great. So you see that classical architecture starts to move around and cover all of this area, so that everyone knows whenever they see a Doric, an Ionic or a Corinthian column, the Greeks have been here and this is the greater Greece of Alexander the Great. Then along come the Romans. Now, Russell Crowe is not technically a Roman. He's a New Zealander, but he's rather spectacular kind of Roman. So I put him in here. And this is the Roman Empire. So you see that classical architecture becomes the language of the Roman Empire. And what do the Romans do? They say, well, here is our kind of architecture, and now classical architecture is what defines the borders of Rome. And this is the temple of Nîmes. It's called the Maison Carrée, the square house. And it's a really important building in the language of classical architecture because it becomes like the model for all classical architecture that comes after it. Now, the Romans, 3 orders is not really enough when you've got an empire as big as ours. So they decided to add the Tuscan order, which is a little bit like the Doric order, and the composite order, which takes the acanthus leaves of the Corinthian column and puts the Ionic scrolls on the top. Now, that's the Roman period. How is it that though 2,000 or so years later, we've still got classical architecture everywhere? Well, there is a period of the Middle Ages, and everyone said that during the Middle Ages, everyone was being kind of religious and hanging around in monasteries and not really interested in the architecture of the pagan world. But the thing is that the monks in the monasteries actually kept the classical tradition alive by writing books and transcribing books. And then we have the rebirth of classical architecture in the Renaissance period. And I've used this example of the School of Athens because the School of Athens shows how classical culture comes back into the Renaissance world after it's sort of sleeps a little bit during the Middle Ages. Now, one of the other main reasons why we still have classical architecture around is because of this guy called Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman architect, and his treatise was rediscovered in the Renaissance, and they republished his book. So his treatise was basically a manual of how to build buildings. And there was an edition of Vitruvius from 1521. There was another one in 1556 and 67, another one in the 1680s and all the way to the 1720s. So you can see that the classical tradition is staying alive because people are writing books about it and republishing it and translating it in so many different languages around the world. So the printing press and the invention of the printing press is also one of the major reasons why we still have all of these columns here today. Then in the Renaissance, we also had architects writing their own treatises because they said, we're designing architecture for the Renaissance world. Why aren't we not writing our own treatises? So Leon Battista Alberti also wrote his own treatise, and he's also quite an important architect because he was one of the first people to put the laws of perspective down into a book. The other Renaissance remakes of Vitruvius are Alberti, as I said, Vignola, who just wrote a book about the orders. And then the other really important guy is Palladio. Palladio is important because he also gets translated into English quite early. And what was interesting about Palladio is that he said, I'm not just going to write a book about how ancient architecture is designed. I'm going to also bring ancient architecture into it. So there's the Temple of Jove on the Palatine, so that's him drawing an ancient temple from Greek times, but also putting in contemporary architecture like the Tempietto. The other thing that Palladio did is he used his treatise as a way to sell his work. So he said, here's an ideal building by, one Renaissance architect, the one in the middle. Here's an ideal building by, an ancient Greek guy. And here's one of my own buildings that you might also like to look at that I think is as good as everything that came before me. So it was a real self-promoter, old Andrea. Now, how does it then move into the later periods and out of the realm of architecture? In the 1700s, there's a discovery of ancient Rome and the discovery of the ruins. So there's Goethe. They're sort of having a bit of a lie down between looking at ancient ruins. Here is the artist in despair about the grandeur of ancient Rome. So Rome really also gets rediscovered because of the Grand Tour, and everyone is really interested in all of this architecture and all of this art. And in fact, at this time, there was even a new illness that came about because people were looking at so much beautiful architecture that they tended to faint and have heart attacks, and it was called Stendhal's syndrome. In fact, there's a movie called Stendhal's syndrome, I discovered. And here's an example of then how classical architecture was used to both talk about a concept of empire but also have this sense of ruin. This is a painting of the Bank of England by Sir John Soane that was already painted as if it was falling apart. And what it was a kind of premonition about the fall of the British Empire. So let's then move along to architecture in the 19th century, and you can see that the Maison Carrée, which I showed you before, basically gets copied into the Church of Saint Genevieve in France, and it's also used a lot in the United States. That's the capital in Virginia. And another reason why the classical style is used everywhere and a lot by architects is because of this guy here called Bannister Fletcher. Have a look at his tree of architecture here, and I think this is really interesting. Basically says these are all the things that make architecture: social, religious and geographic issues. But look at the tree trunk. If you look at the tree trunk of Bannister Fletcher's tree of architecture, all of the classical styles are on the trunk of the tree. Whereas other weird styles, like, Asian styles or Italian styles or others, they all come from classical architecture. So you can see that this idea that classical architecture is the universal language of architecture is also communicated through this book. And this was the ultimate textbook of architectural history for a very, very long time. So getting back to, and I'm just finishing up, I have no idea what's going with time. Oh, okay. Oh, right. Okay, good. I was going super fast. Back to the language of empire. So remember I said that Alexander the Great was the first person to use classicism as a language of empire, and then that was also taken on by the Romans and happened in the Renaissance period. The next group of people to really take the concept of classical architecture as a language of empire was the British Empire. So you can see this image here of Britannia there and all of her British colonies. And that's basically then how we get classical architecture over here in Melbourne. So classical architecture becomes the language of certain things like wealth and communication. So you can see that the Queen Victoria markets, the Treasury building are all connected to wealth, and we use the language of classical architecture to communicate it. Communication, like post offices. So you look at any main post office, any GPO in a capital city in Australia, you'll find that it's classical. But also little ones, like the post office in Euroa and this building here that used to be the post office in Waverley. When Wade told me that I was coming to give this talk, one of the things I did is start actually just taking lots of photos of classical architecture so that you could see how many examples they are all over the place. The other two really important things that classical architecture communicates are knowledge and power, and I put them together on the same slide for anyone who's a fan of Foucault. But you can see the idea of knowledge with the State Library of Victoria, power through Parliament House, but also through the Government House here in Melbourne. But if these buildings are places that communicate the power of institutions, notice that they're also used as places of protest against institutions. Notice that Parliament House and the State Library, which are, in a sense, buildings that communicate knowledge and power, are also targeted by protesters to speak against constructs of knowledge and power. Classical architecture is also used, architects want to be smartasses. This is 101 Collins Street, and you can see that the columns, the Doric columns up the front, they're not actually holding anything up. And that's because Philip Johnson over there with the architect glasses thinks that he's such a wag that he could design columns that don't hold anything up. But the last thing I want to talk about in the last 2 minutes, I believe, is how important classical architecture is for identity of everyday people. This is a building in Tunis, in Africa, and it was actually built in the Sicilian quarter because the Italians living in Tunis wanted to identify themselves within the city, and they chose classical architecture to do so. The Greeks do the same thing. Here's the Moreland Hotel. I don't know if anyone's been in there, but it's an absolute classic. And then I love this building here because this building is in Five Dock in Sydney, which actually has something like 20% of its population are actually of Italian origin. But this is what's called a Dutch barn house. So the form is a Dutch barn, but you see the Greeks have come along, added their Corinthian columns, and then painted it all blue and white. So the Greeks are saying, we still own classical architecture, thank you very much. And then you can see it everywhere from a suburban house to a block of flats. And then I thought, quite interestingly, this Catholic church in Waverley as well uses classical architecture for the local representation of the community, whereas St Mary's Cathedral, which is the main Catholic church of Sydney, uses a Gothic style. And then my favourite example is this is a water tank. Like, don't ask me why you would clothe a water tank in classical architecture. Not really sure. But anyway, I'm now going to finish on this very last slide to really bring classical architecture into the 21st century. And thanks, Wade, for sending me the image. And thanks, all of you, for listening.
That was just so fantastic. I think sometimes you see a talk and it ruins you forever because now wherever you go, you're going to be seeing columns and you're going to be asking your partner or your friend, what do you think that is? Is that a Doric or is that Corinthian? Or be a good conversation starter. A few things. I love that Nerd Night is one of the few places you can go that's going to have a Foucault pun. So thank you for bringing that.
Thank you.
There's going to be a protest next Monday for the March for Equality. And of course, in Melbourne, that's going to be at the State Library. Again, a place of knowledge and power. So that makes sense. And you should go if you can do that. Now we're going to go to questions. If you've never been to Nerd Night, we've got a couple minutes to ask questions from the audience. And there's some research that indicates that if a woman in the audience asks the first questions, more women will ask more questions. And so I'm going to put you on the spot. Is there a woman in the audience who has a question for Flavia? First right of refusal. Yes.
What's your favorite column?
What's your favorite column?
Oh, yeah, got to be the Ionic column. One, because
Why?
I identify it as a matron,
Yes.
as a somewhat of a 1:7 proportion, but all, you know, I think for the hairdo and the volutes, like, you know, I love a good scroll anywhere. So yeah, Ionic definitely.
Who doesn't love a good scroll? I mean, all right, next question. Yeah, right in the front. You guys are keen.
So, like, what happens if the place where the column needs to be is too tall? Like, is there ever any chance for it to not take the ratio, or does it always stick to the ratio?
So the question is it always going to stick to that same ratio, or do people break the rules? Is it a structural thing? Why does that rule exist?
Okay, so it's always, 1:7, 1:8, but the composite column could go to 1:9. And the Tuscan column could get smaller to 1:5, so the Romans kind of expanded that. But the thing is that if you needed to hold stuff up, you just put more columns in. So the other thing was also that the distance, so say, can you just be a column, Wade? Would you like to be, should we both
Lifetime dream.
Should we both be Doric?
Ionic, please.
We'll both be Ionic columns. So the distance between me and Wade in a column, in a temple, has to be 2 times our width. So also...
And I'm really sucking it in right now to get the exact perfect lines.
So the distance but if we were both Doric columns, we'd have to be a bit further apart. And if we're both Corinthian columns, we'd have to be a little bit closer in. Because it depends on all of our proportions. So the amount of columns that are at the front of a temple also has to do with the proportions and the modules.
But so why can't you just put, like, the scrolls on the top of a Tuscan column?
So the question is, why can't you just put the scrolls on the top of a
I think if you're in Las Vegas,
it's just not done.
you probably can. Right? So if you wanted to follow all the rules that were in the books, the Vitruvius books and the treatises, there's very specific rules about what you want to do. But the thing is, like, I didn't get a chance to talk about the Baroque period, but in the 17th and 18th century, they were doing all sorts of wacky shit with columns and breaking all of the rules. So yes, you can break the rules if you want, but the thing is that, like, it's okay to break rules as long as you learn them first. So that, you know, learn all the rules and be good, and then just go crazy and break them if you want to.
Is there a question from anyone out there? Men are welcome now. Yes. Front row, you guys are eager. I love it.
Back in Greece, in Corinth,
Yep.
were you able to use a Doric column, or was that like a...
So the question is, back in Greece, were they able to mix and match, basically? If they were in that period, did they go back and use a previous period's column?
Well, different locations.
Yeah, you could use them anywhere. Yeah. No. I know that Sparta and Corinth always had quite a bit of beef. This is true. But no, you can pretty much use them anywhere as long as you kind of follow the rules of the proportions. And also, what tended to happen is that if the temple, they're originally only for temples, so if you use it for a male god, you should use a male column And if you're using building a temple to a female god, you should use a female column. But that's kind of like a rule of thumb that wasn't really followed that much.
One more question? No? Okay, I've got one question, and that is, Flavia is a scholar of fascist architecture. The
Yes.
fascist, I was at a talk recently where the person was talking about how fascist architecture, it was your talk.
I know.
You're like, who was it? Who was it?
Who's talking
That's
about
my area. You were saying that the early fascists got very modern in their approach, and then they went back to this behemoth, monolithic kind of approach later on. So why did they go back to columns?
Yeah, so 20 minutes I couldn't put it all in, but usually Italian, like modernist architecture said that it broke away from the past, but it actually did use classical ideas in terms of the harmony and the proportions. So the way that the facade was laid out still used those kind of proportions, but didn't use the decorative aspect. And so modern architecture was still classical in its composition, but not in its ornament and style. Then, in the second half of the fascist regime, they went back to this very strong classical ideal in the architectural expression. And that was mainly a structural reason, actually, because to build modern architecture, you need to put lots of steel in it, right? And Italy in 1936 had invaded Ethiopia and caused the League of Nations to place sanctions on the country. So they couldn't import steel anymore, and they had to go back to the classical style of architecture because they basically had to hold buildings up without steel.
Love it. That is such a great answer. Can you please put your hands together for Flavia?